Good day. Welcome to American Security Council Foundation Peace Through Strength podcast series. Today I'm delighted to have with me Mr. Rob Pierce, Vice President at American Global Strategies in Washington, D.C. Rob is a graduate of Wake Forest with a master's degree from Georgetown. He served in the U.S. Navy and has worked with SEAL teams in various areas. But our subject today is China. Why is China buying up U.S. farmland? And with that introduction, I will pass the conversation on to Rob. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Looking forward to the discussion. So the question of why China is buying U.S. farmland, I think, requires a little bit of explanation as to why China is a threat in the first place and why your average American should care about this. Fundamentally, the issue is that China is the most formidable adversary that the United States has had in recent times, and this is because they pose a credible threat in the military, economic, and technological domains, and critically, because they have a grand national strategy to displace the United States atop the global pecking order and institute what they would like to see as a lessening of American power and a growing of Chinese power on the global stage and making the world safe for autocracy. So China is a very big threat regionally in the Indo-Pacific, but critically, they're becoming an increasingly big threat in the U.S. domestically. And this is where the issue of China farmland comes into play. The American people can no longer view the China threat as a distant threat that does not impact them. It impacts every single one of us through what China is attempting to accomplish on U.S. soil. And this includes traditional espionage, spying on U.S. military or intel communities to gain sensitive intelligence. It includes economic espionage, in what's been called the greatest wealth transfer in human history. And it includes countering messaging that the Chinese view as detrimental to their cause. So this can be the suppression of dissidents or the suppression of Chinese American citizens. And farmland is just one cog in that machine of how China is attempting to gain influence now and critically attempting to gain influence later in the event that the Chinese and the United States go to a shooting war, a kinetic war, which they hope does not happen, but they want to have as much leverage as they can over the U.S. people, over U.S. policymakers, to ensure that when that fight does come, they are well positioned for it.
Yeah, I think I'd add, to me anyways, I think that when we say China, we're really talking about the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP.
Absolutely.
And to me, they're the greatest threat in American existence, that they have the capabilities and certainly the wherewithal to basically threaten the existence of the United States. And they're doing it in what I and many others have said, that what is called a smokeless, unrestricted warfare, which you alluded to. Namely, they would much rather win by not shooting. They want to do it through corruption from within, and they're sort of following the playbook of Sun Tzu, a couple of thousand-year-old philosopher of China, who basically said the way to win a war is never fire a shot, but to corrupt the enemy from within. And they're sort of following along that footsteps example, and certainly buying up farmland is just one of the many aspects of this unrestricted, smokeless war that the CCP is waging on American civilization. And I always add it's a civilization. I'm a big fan of Huntington's Clash of Civilizations book, and I think the United States has to recognize, that's the first thing we have to do, is to recognize the threat from the CCP. And if you don't recognize the threat, you can't solve the problem. So
absolutely, completely agree. And I'm glad you brought up that the adversary here is not the Chinese people, it's the Chinese Communist Party. It's important to remember that the first and foremost victim of the depredations of the Chinese Communist Party is the Chinese people.
Yes.
And one need look no further than what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghur population to see that. Yes. So yeah, I very much agree. And then of course I very much agree with Chinese ambitions is, yes, they do want to win without firing a shot. Are they preparing to win a kinetic war and massively mobilizing and modernizing their military? They are.
Yes.
But they would much prefer to win this battle without firing a shot. And because this is the Peace Through Strength podcast, President Reagan said, we know all too well that when the forces of freedom, we know all too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong, but when they are weak. That is when tyrants are tempted. So what China is trying to do, they look at the world stage and they know the United States is their first and foremost competitor. It's the strongest power in the world. So they're trying to weaken us domestically. And that's exactly what they're trying to do. And it's a part of their grand strategic ambition to displace the United States.
And I would add, I think they're doing a darn good job from their perspective of weakening us internally. And the cultural war that they're waging against the United States, and again, American civilization and Western civilization, is personified in TikTok. And TikTok is poisoning our culture, poisoning our youth. And yet we have the White House now using TikTok. Congress passed a law saying that they either sell to American interests or leave. And President Trump keeps on extending it, and now he's signed up for TikTok. So I'm concerned that the president and his group don't recognize the exact threat. Mike Gallagher, former rep from Wisconsin and now part of the Palantir group, has said that we should definitely do something about TikTok and get rid of all the Chinese students. And again, Trump has said, oh, he's okay with 600,000 over 2 years type of thing. Students being in the United States, they come to the United States and basically they're stealing our technologies to take home so that they can bury us. And they act as mules, cash mules in the fentanyl trade. So there's another example of the cultural war where the Chinese CCP is poisoning us through fentanyl and other things. So it's overwhelming.
Absolutely. I mean, the amount of threats, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And this is part of the concern is there's not going to be a Pearl Harbor 9/11 moment where all of a sudden the American people wake up to the China threat. The China threat already exists. It's already here, and it's presenting itself through numerous different vectors. And just because you brought up the fentanyl case, I think this is such a salient example. Is before I joined the Navy, I actually worked on the Hill for a U.S. Senator from Ohio, and this was back in 2016, and he did a trip to China, and he talked to who at the time was the #2, the vice premier, about the issue of fentanyl, the Chinese shipping fentanyl to the United States. He was from Southwest Ohio, and fentanyl was ravishing Southwest Ohio as it was communities across the country. And the #2 in China looked at the U.S. senator and said, "It's awfully rich of you to try to lecture us about fentanyl when it was you that got us addicted to opium during the Opium Wars." To which the senator, of course, replied, first, that wasn't the United States, that was the British. And second, that was in the 19th century. But the view of the Chinese is that they are in an existential battle against the West, and they lump the United States in with the UK, and every action taken against them is part of this global environment in which they were humiliated in their century of humiliation, and they are attempting to retake what they view as their rightful place atop the global pecking order.
Yes, and President Xi of China constantly brings up that period in history of the humiliation for Chinese and the series of unequal treaties. Namely, for example, Hong Kong was ceded to the British, and they've since corrected that problem. And that Taiwan was part of China. Yes and no. It was never part of China that was ruled by the CCP, but it certainly was part of China, and the inhabitants of Taiwan are of Chinese ethnic origin. But while we're talking about the unequal treaties, I know there's a great love affair going on right now between Russia and the CCP and China. But if I were the Russians, I would be mentally prepared to lose maybe 1/3 of their country to the Chinese, because a good slug of a good area of Siberia under now Russian control at one time was sort of under Chinese influence. And Vladivostok and other areas in Siberia we're definitely under Chinese influence. And so if Xi intends to fulfill his mission of correcting the unequal treaties, Russia is going to be in his sights also. So long term, I don't see how the two of them are going to get along. And it's clearly China's in the driver's seat. So
yeah, that's an interesting thought. And, nations don't have permanent allies, they have permanent interests. And China's interests do not necessarily align with those of the Russians. And while axis of evil forming and a nexus between Russia and China and North Korea, as we saw recently with the Chinese military parade, there is no shortage of disagreement and mistrust between these powers and these major players. And I view it more largely as an alliance of convenience than it is an alliance of values that the United States has with its allies, which of course is one of the pivotal benefits of our system. And one of the most important things that we need to ensure that we promote is this network of alliances we have, not only for the values and the messaging, but also just in terms of scale. The United States on its own cannot match China in scale, people or production. But when we add our allies to the mix, we absolutely can, and we outperform them.
So what message would you say to the American people? What has to be done to counter the CCP's plan of action? I mean, what do we do besides maintain the alliances and rebuild our industrial base? To me, one of the problems is of messaging. We just don't seem to recognize the problem with China. I mean, Florida, for example, just passed a law a year or two ago banning Chinese ownership of more than 2 acres and so forth. Federal appeals court overruled it, saying the federal law supersedes, and Trump has signed a recent law that's limited in scope. So until the government, the federal government and the people as a whole recognize the threat, I don't see how we're going to solve the problem.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And that might be the most important question. And, I often think of this quote, and I'll probably misattribute it if I try to think of the person's name, but it's national pride is to countries what self-respect is to individuals. It's a necessary condition for self-improvement. So we as a country have to agree on the fundamentals. And chief amongst those fundamentals is that the United States is the greatest country in the world. It's the greatest political experiment to ever exist. And while we are not perfect, we should always remember the blessings of living in this country. We should always strive for better, yes, but it's important to remember, it's important for our leaders to espouse a sense of national pride amongst our citizens. And all of the polling data suggests that national pride continues its downward trajectory, especially amongst young people. So continue, go ahead.
I was going to say, so what do you attribute to that? I have my theory on that one too, as you can well imagine. But
definitely. That I think there are a lot of different things that contribute to that trajectory. I think a part of it is the partisan political discourse in which it is now popular for, politicians to speak negatively upon the institutions of which they are a part of, which leads to a, weakening of the trust that U.S. citizens have in their institutions. I think a part of it is the politicization of everything. You can't get away from partisan politics. You can't get away from seeing the divide. You can't get away from opening up social media and seeing, attacks or shootings or negativity. If it bleeds, it leads. And the American people are inundated with everything that's bad about this country because, quite frankly, it drives clicks. I also think that there is a directed and concerted effort on behalf of our adversaries, Russia and China, to drive these narratives. You mentioned TikTok earlier. TikTok is certainly censorious of any rhetoric that's counter to the Chinese prevailing ideology, but they're more than happy to push narratives that are negative about the United States, are negative about democracy.
Yes.
So I could probably go on this answer for quite a long time, but I do think that, in the past couple of years, there has been an acknowledgement that we may have hit a nadir in the 2020-2021 timeframe in terms of the anti-American ideology that was so prevalent, and we seem to be, I hope, coming out of that. But we do have to get our house in order if we are going to confront the challenges posed by the CCP.
Well, I would also add Islam, but that's another subject down the road. But to me, when you get back to the reason why we're so divisive is Marxian ideology of oppressed versus oppressor. And it goes back to the universities. I mean, after the Vietnam War, the universities became increasingly Marxist with their professorships. And Marxism views the world of oppressed versus the oppressor. So, for example, a good example is this, what to me is a moment that I don't quite understand, but I do understand. And it's sad that Hamas murdered 1,200 Israeli Jews, and the world is condemning Israel for being an occupier. They weren't occupying Gaza, and they're occupying their historical homeland. And for people to equate the existence of Israel as being an oppressor of the poor oppressed Arabs, to me is a sign that the intellectual system in America, the education system, has corrupted. I mean, it's astounding to me the turmoil that's been created in the American universities and education system by this whole concept of oppressed versus oppressor, which is Marxist. Of course, originally it was the landowner, the proletariat versus the capitalist, but that didn't fly, so now they've gone into this racial ideology, oppressed versus oppressor kind of thing. And until we solve the problem of the universities and education, we might see a dip upward for American pride, but the fundamentals of trying to take down American civilization of free enterprise, free speech, free religion, and opportunity, as opposed to the socialist dictates of communism and Islam, for that matter, is another subject altogether. So,
no, I very much agree with the commentary on viewing the world through the lens of the oppressed and the oppressor. If you view the world strictly through a hierarchy of grievances, you're bound to miss what is actually causing things like the Hamas attack to occur.
Yes.
And if you look at, and we don't have to spend too much time talking about this conflict, but if you look at why there seems to be alignment between Hamas and LGBT supporters on one side, who have absolutely no value systems in common whatsoever. And in fact, they are diametrically opposed, but they, for some reason, are supporting one another. The only conclusion that I can reach is that they share one overarching goal, which is anti-Western ideology.
Yes.
Which is anti-oppressor ideology.
Yes.
If you view Israel, you view the United States as an oppressor, then we have alignment no matter what the other differences may be. And again, this brings us back to the CCP model, which is the ends justify the means.
Yes.
And anything is acceptable so long as it gets us towards our end goal.
Right.
And I think we really need to be aware of this fact.
Well, you're sort of alluding to the red-green alliance of Marxism with Islam, and they don't have much in common at all, other than the fact they want to take down Western civilization, and so they work together to achieve that, or try to achieve that goal. So, getting back to the CCP in America, we had on our program a few weeks ago Steve Robinson from the Maine Wire, and he has done extensive investigative work in the state of Maine, which, as you know, is a relatively small state population-wise, 1.5 million or so. But the extent to which Chinese nationals own farmland in Maine, they own 300 of the 600 legal marijuana farms, which produces far more marijuana than can be consumed in Maine. So they're exporting it to states that don't have legalization yet for the extent of growing. But he's using that as an example where they're taking over industries and generating tremendous volumes of cash, which they use to bribe local officials to buy up other properties. I have a friend of mine that goes up to Maine. He's originally from Maine, and he says they're buying even blueberry bogs now up there. They're buying everything. And in New Hampshire, they just bought a $15 million warehouse office complex for $60 million. So they spent 4 times what the market value was to get this huge piece of property right near a waterworks in Nashua, New Hampshire area. So
and the BAE facility,
yes,
which is one of our defense primes.
Yeah, I spent most of my life in the Metro Boston, and I always considered southern New Hampshire to be part of Metro Boston. But and so yes, I'm familiar with that. And there's a space station up there in Manchester and Bedford. So they're buying up, and we know in Florida they're buying up properties, and it's just going on. In your article, you mentioned the military bases in Texas and up in South Dakota. Why don't you talk about the one in Texas? That's the one that intrigues me more than almost anyone. How many acres? 140,000, 143,000 acres? Or?
Yeah, 130,000 acres. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And my attention to China, the CCP buying land in the United States began with the stories about China buying land near U.S. military installations. And the 2 kind of paradigmatic examples of this are the one that you just mentioned in Texas, where a former CCP high-ranking military officer bought 130,000 acres in close proximity to Laughlin Air Force Base and was going to install a wind farm, despite it not being a particularly windy area. And there were obvious concerns over espionage, whether that be signals intelligence, potential down the road electronic warfare, or just more generally surveillance in this area. And credit to Texas lawmakers for eventually halting this. The other example is in Grand Forks, North Dakota, where a group that had been purchased by what is called the Fufeng Group, which is an agricultural company in China, attempted to buy thousands of acres near a very sensitive Air Force base in North Dakota that deals with drone and satellite technology. And again, thanks to people paying attention, state legislators, as well as at the federal level, this was eventually halted, and credit to the Air Force for calling this out and saying what a grave national security risk this posed. And so I began looking into this because this was actually 2 relative success stories. We prevented what could have been 2 obvious instances of Chinese espionage occurring near sensitive military installations. And then the more I read into it, the more I heard exactly what you just said, which is, yes, them buying land near military installations is a grave concern, but that seems to work as far as when the U.S. or people in the U.S. flag this as a concern. We don't want our chief competitor, our number 1 adversary, buying land near sensitive military installations because it poses a threat due to signals intelligence concerns or due to potentially simply surveillance concerns, or even planting things at this base for use down the road, right? Yeah. But at least that is being paid attention to. But what appears to be worse is what you just mentioned in Maine and New Hampshire and Florida, because that is not being addressed at the level of scale that it needs to be addressed at. And it's such a concerted effort by the CCP to create leverage for them in the economic domain over communities in America. And again, we need to ask ourselves, are we okay with our number 1 global competitor, our chief adversary, a country who unapologetically and regularly points to the United States and says, that is our chief competitor? Are we okay with them buying land near sensitive military installations? I think the answer should obviously be no. But are we okay with them buying blueberry farms in New Hampshire and potentially using that as leverage down the road? The answer there should be no as well. And then the last thing I'll just say is this issue of reciprocity. A U.S. corporation cannot go, or me or you cannot go to China and buy land. But Chinese companies can come here, and so long as they are, as you just said, paying 4 times over the asking price, they're oftentimes welcomed with open arms by some of these companies because they see check marks, unfortunately.
Yes.
Not that you and I would want to buy land in China, but this idea of reciprocity, if they don't allow us to do these things, why should we allow them to do it, especially when it's so obvious that it could present a concern down the road?
I couldn't agree with you more. As a matter of fact, that was my next subject. So it just shows you, I think, along the same lines. Reciprocity, to me, should be one of the foundations of our policy. And if the Chinese will not allow us to own land in China, why do we allow them to own anything in America? And I would take that back to TikTok. American companies have firewalls against them in China. We cannot operate social media platforms in China, media platforms. So why do we allow them to operate here in America? So I like the old military kiss it system. Keep it simple, stupid. If we have a policy of reciprocity, let's follow it. And if you won't allow us to buy land in China, well, then you can't buy land here. If you don't allow our social media groups to operate in China, you can't operate here. But it all goes back to the basic fact that we have to educate, and this is what American Security Council Foundation's been doing since 1958, is educating Americans on issues of national security. And China, by far, is the greatest threat to America in its history, as far as I'm concerned. So we have to recognize this, and we have to do the best we can in promoting the concept that we have to recognize to solve the problem. It's the old Japanese system of Kaizen. You have to recognize the issue and then to order to take correction. And we have to start acting on the basis that China is a threat to us as an existence, and we should act accordingly.
Absolutely. It's a threat now. It's a serious threat now, and it requires action. We cannot passively allow this to happen. And just, they do not view our magnanimity as a kindness to be reciprocated. They view it as a weakness to be exploited.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that this is a nation that does not have our best interests in mind. One of the things that I often find frustrating in discourse around global politics and national security is this idea that history inexorably moves towards progress.
No,
it does not.
It does not.
And it does not. And the only way we are going to maintain our freedoms is if we actively pursue the courses of action that will allow us to do so. And that requires the United States being a stronger power than the Chinese Communist Party. And it requires not allowing the Chinese Communist Party to get away with what they've been getting away with in terms of aggression regionally in the Indo-Pacific, but critically, it mandates that we not allow them to get away with what they have been getting away with here domestically in the United States for far too long.
So how do we get the population, how do we get Americans to do something about it? Elect the right people in Congress, I guess.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Well, I think it's going to require people like yourself and organizations like yours continuing to get the word out. It's going to require politicians being clear-eyed and honest with the American people about the threat that they're seeing. And I think to your point earlier, the education part of this is key. It's going to require, number one, an understanding amongst the American people about the value proposition of the United States, what an exceptional nation we are. And number two, that we are an exceptional nation that is the envy of the world, but there are negative actors out there that would like to see us fall.
Yes.
And in order for us not to fall, we have to take concrete steps to prevent those actors from doing what they want to do.
Yeah, I agree. Easier said than done, huh, Rob?
Easier said than done. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts? I mean, we could talk about all the things the Chinese are doing to take us down the cyber warfare and all these other things, the money laundering and buying of politicians, and we've seen that happen in Washington, D.C., and buying of local politicians, and the hypocrisy that goes on in regards to China. And you certainly highlighted some of the things. I would, they talk about the colonialism. China's one of the great colonizers in the history of the world. Look at Tibet.
That's right.
Look at Xinjiang. It used to be called Turkestan. So, and Mongolia is no doubt in their sights. And as I mentioned earlier, Siberia, just a question of time, as far as I'm concerned, before they grab a slug of that part of the world too. So.
Yeah, and I would say their neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism extends even beyond their near abroad to places like Venezuela and what they're doing with the Belt and Road Initiative and debt trap diplomacy, where these countries become completely beholden on them economically, and China gains political leverage over them.
Yeah, so they're going to be around for a while, but we have to be view it in terms of a civilizational war, and they're going to win some, we're going to win some, but we have to recognize that they're a threat to the existence of the United States, and so act accordingly. So,
absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'll just give 2 closing thoughts, if that's all right.
Yep.
So the first is, I spent a lot of time as a China military analyst, and certainly the China military is a huge threat and viewed as the pacing threat by the United States. And what often gets discussed is the threat of a Chinese invasion over Taiwan.
Yes.
But what I like to remind people of with the Chinese invasion over Taiwan is that the first shot will likely not be, China firing a missile salvo at Taiwan or at an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. It'll be President Xi calling up U.S. companies and saying, you better not support any retribution against us, or we're going to nationalize your companies, or we're going to create iPhones on our own, or we're going to take trillions of dollars of market cap away from the United States. Or it's going to be looking at these small towns in Texas and North Dakota and Florida and Vermont and saying, we have access to your electric grid. We can turn the lights off. We have access to all of this infrastructure and farmland that we can do tremendous damage to. So that's part, when we talk about China trying to create political leverage in the United States, that's part of what their goal is. Part of their goal is so they can do whatever they want on a global stage. And we in the US, because of the leverage that they created, are too afraid or we don't have the political will to respond. And that is something that we need to be very cognizant of and guard against. And then, the second thing I said, just the second closing thought is, of course, a lot of the response to China must exist at the federal level. Of course, the military and sanctions exist, at the direction of the federal government. But so much of the response to China has to occur at the state and local level. So it's things like, like buying up farmland near that military base in North Dakota, or buying these plants in Florida, potentially near ports or critical infrastructure. It requires diligence and a level of awareness of this threat from your average American that, hey, something doesn't look right. We should pressure our local elected leaders to take a look at this and get something done.
Thank you, Rob. Sums it up very well, and I agree with you 100%. So thank you for joining with us. This is the American Security Council Foundation. We appreciate your support, and please look us up and donate on www.ascf.us. So again, thank you, Rob.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.